The story of Wu, a woman whose life is marked by suffering and tragic circumstances, is one that unfolds within a web of neglect, emotional manipulation, and a desperate desire for love. From the earliest days of her childhood, Wu's life was shaped by a deep sense of unfairness, beginning with the preferential treatment her brothers received from their parents. Her parents' bias towards sons over daughters meant that Wu, despite being older, was relegated to roles of responsibility, often leaving her isolated and deprived. From there, this all begins. As a child, Wu was forced to abandon her education in elementary school, missing out on the chance to learn and integrate with her peers. Instead, she took on the burdens of adulthood at a young age, taking care of her siblings and managing the household chores. She received no recognition or gratitude from her parents for these sacrifices. Her brothers were always given the best food, while she had to make do with the leftovers. These experiences left deep emotional scars, making Wu feel neglected and unloved. Despite all the hardships, Wu never blamed her parents. However, the feeling of being undervalued and overlooked grew with time. Her parents treated her like a means to an end, using her labor until she was married. This left Wu with no sense of worth or self-worth, and her heart became hardened with years of mistreatment. As time passed, Wu began to see marriage as the only means of escape from her bleak existence. She dreamed of finding someone who would provide the love and attention she so desperately sought. In 2004, when Wu was 22, her parents arranged a marriage to Moju, a man from a well-off family. The marriage was viewed not as a bond of love, but as a transaction to improve the family's social standing. The arrangement revealed the stark contrast between Wu's background and her husband's. While Wu had been burdened with hardship and responsibilities from a young age, Moju had been pampered and protected by his mother, who made all the decisions in his life. The couple's marriage was strained, as the tensions between Wu and her mother-in-law created a difficult atmosphere. Mr. Jung, Wu's father-in-law, was the only person who showed any understanding and kindness toward her. He was a man who balanced emotional honesty with a sense of responsibility. Wu cherished the moments when her father-in-law was home, as his presence provided a sense of warmth and unity that she had never known. She admired him, and over time, Wu's frustration with her husband and her longing for affection led her to seek solace in her father-in-law's company. Wu began to feel that the only time she was truly happy was when Mr. Jung was around. One memorable incident occurred during a New Year's Eve dinner when Wu's mother-in-law, Mrs. Liu, chose to eat separately with her son, leaving Wu with only a bowl of rice and vegetables. This intentional act of exclusion made Wu feel even more isolated, but when Mr. Jung returned home with thoughtful gifts for the family, she saw a glimmer of hope. Mr. Jung's actions, in stark contrast to the dismissive treatment she received from her mother-in-law, made Wu appreciate him even more. Mr. Jung, aware of the tension in the family, took action and demanded that his wife and son apologize to Wu for their mistreatment. Temporarily resolve. Although the conflict was temporarily resolved, things returned to their previous state once Mr. Jung left for work. The situation grew worse when Mr. Jung decided to bring Moju to work with him at the construction site, leaving Wu and her mother-in-law to live together in the same house. The atmosphere between the two women became even more tense, to the point where Mrs. Liu refused to let Wu hold her own child. This suffocating environment pushed Wu to frequently visit her husband at his workplace, where she found more opportunities to see her father-in-law. Wu's relationship with Mr. Jung gradually grew more complex, as she found herself becoming emotionally attached to him. She began to confide in him, sharing her feelings and her desire for a better life. Mr. Jung, who had always been perceptive and kind, offered her emotional support. However, as time passed, the relationship between Wu and her father-in-law took an unhealthy turn. Wu found herself in an emotional entanglement with him that went beyond the normal bounds of a father-in-law and daughter-in-law. Despite her growing affection, Mr. Jung recognized the situation and decided to distance himself from Wu, choosing to have Moju quit his job and return home. He hoped that this would ease the tension between Wu and her mother-in-law, while also creating more space between himself and his daughter-in-law. Unfortunately, Wu was determined to find ways to meet her father-in-law, even without her husband working at the construction site. To reduce their interactions, Mr. Jung began working night shifts, hoping to avoid further rumors and complications. But their relationship continued to develop in secret. Wu's feelings for her father-in-law deepened, and they spent more time together. Their secret affection remained hidden for a long time, with Wu justifying their closeness as the result of the long period of care and understanding they had developed. Their bond was seemingly unbreakable, and Wu felt that she had found the love she had always longed for. However, the illicit nature of their relationship eventually caught up with them. In 2008, a tragic event occurred when Mr. Jung fell from a construction site, sustaining severe injuries that required hospitalization. With Mrs. Liu unable to travel due to motion sickness, Wu offered to care for her father-in-law at the hospital. This decision unknowingly set the stage for the further escalation of their inappropriate relationship. As Wu cared for him, she began to express her feelings for him openly. Mr. Jung, moved by her devotion, reciprocated her emotions. Once Mr. Jung's wounds healed, he quit his job and returned home to rest. From then on, Wu and Mr. Jung's relationship became more open, and their bond continued to grow. Their actions remained discreet, but the nature of their relationship was becoming increasingly apparent to those around them. They explained their closeness as a result of the time spent caring for each other, but the rumors began to spread, and the situation became harder to hide. End of their game. Eventually, Mrs. Liu discovered the truth when she walked in on her husband and daughter-in-law in a compromising position. Furious, she confronted her husband, but he repeatedly denied any involvement. Despite the denials, the family dynamic began to crumble. Mrs. Liu, feeling humiliated and betrayed, decided to leave the family, finding a job as a nanny to distance herself from the painful reality of the situation. Moju, too, was unable to accept the betrayal and left, taking their children with him to live with his uncle. This left Wu in a position where she could finally express her feelings openly without fear of reproach. However, the news of their affair spread throughout the village, and they were met with disdain and scorn from the community. Wu, however, was unbothered by the public's judgment, while Mr. Jung became increasingly ashamed of his actions. Unable to bear the constant rumors, Mr. Jung decided that he could no longer continue the relationship with his daughter-in-law. He realized that their affair had become a source of shame for both of them, and he chose to sever ties with Wu. However, Wu, unwilling to let go of what she considered her true love, began to resent her mother-in-law and husband for destroying their relationship. She began to devise a plan to eliminate her mother-in-law and husband, believing that by doing so, she could be with her father-in-law legally. This dark and tragic turn of events led Wu to buy rat poison, intending to poison her husband and mother-in-law. Her first target was her husband, whom she approached under the guise of making amends, but her plan was foiled. The story of Wu's life is one of desperation, emotional manipulation, and the tragic consequences of love that was never meant to be.